Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Susan Kleiner, long overdue. We would have first met back at the Kansas City Fitness Summit many, many years ago. And I saw you presenting, and I was there sitting in the audience as an eager participant. And you are a PhD of nutrition and human performance. You're also a registered dietitian, owner of High Performance Nutrition. You're a best-selling author. I think it's 10 books, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them.
And you also have worked with, like, on the ground with, I think, teams and athletes from most North American pro sports leagues. You work with Olympians, a lot of high-profile athletes. It's an honor to have you.
It is such a pleasure to be here, Andrew. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Get right to it. Do female athletes face more pressure to be lean than men?
Yes, I would say so. The aesthetics side affects even those athletes, especially today, not in aesthetic sports, right? So where you would expect in figure skating, in gymnastics, in the sports where we recognize that their image matters, what we're looking at matters. It also certainly affects their ability to perform at some level. It affects them really today in everything, in volleyball, in basketball. I'd say there is because of the media, because of the advertising opportunity, all of that, what they look like matters. I've worked with Olympic swimmers, female swimmers, and beyond their power to weight ratio, the way they look in a bathing suit, which has nothing to do with their physical performance, matters. And so with the men, today there's more pressure, I would say. I think that men themselves, as well as with all the image issues out there, there is certainly a push for what they look like. I find male cyclists in particular and male long distance runners struggle with being pretty darn lean and narrow and maybe don't look as good on camera as, say, maybe a swimmer or a gymnast. And so the brands are looking, unless they're advertising only singly within their sport, that works because the customer or the consumer wants to be like them. But outside of that sport, it becomes a little more difficult. So there is, here it's not how lean is this athlete, it may be how skinny is looking appearance does this male athlete appear to be. We would like a little more mass on him to appeal to the more general male-centric consumer. So it's an interesting intersection, all of this with the advertising and marketing opportunities.
I've been watching sports for a long time. I grew up on tennis. I like to use tennis because I think female tennis stars were the biggest stars disproportionately over other female athletes much earlier for much longer. Martina Navratilova, Chrissy Everett, Steffi Graf, and even women before them. But I also recall some of the tennis players, like I think Monica Seles, and certainly Serena Williams, faced criticism for their physiques, their body weight, almost at the same level as we saw God, in the early 2000s when people would criticize Britney Spears or Jessica Simpson, who were completely normal looking women for
Right.
even appearing to have a little bit of body fat on them. In a way, I don't recall. I think of some baseball players like David Wells or CC Sabathia or John Kruk, and I know I'm dating
Right.
myself. These are men.
Barry Bonds.
Now, I guess Bonds, of course, was alleged to have used steroids, and he was a very
Right.
muscular guy. But
Right.
all these other guys look like
Right.
beer league.
Right.
They were obese. I'm not even going to pretend
Right.
like they
I
were
will
beer
fix
league.
it. Carl Yastrzemski. Now I really date myself.
There we go. And those men didn't face the media criticism that those
No,
those female stars did.
no, exactly. And it really hit hard on Serena Williams,
Mm.
as we were talking about. And I would say Martina Navratilova certainly had a lot of finger pointing, but the the comments from her own colleagues within her sport were jaw-dropping to me.
Mm.
There was I believe it was a New York Times article, but I could be wrong. It was a big nationwide article with interviews of her competitors who were not as successful as she was, but were still highly prominent female athletes, saying, if I had to choose between winning like Serena or looking like Serena, I would not, and had to look like Serena, I would not want to look like Serena. And that just, I couldn't believe that that comment was even coming out. And here it was, open in a national forum.
This episode is brought to you by Macros First. I've always struggled with nutrition tracking apps, even the slightest hassle or friction, and it breaks my habit. That changed with Macros First. When I tried it, I told my friend, the founder, Jacob, quote, this is, well, let's just call it a certain other app on steroids. It's the easiest app to use, and it has a free barcode scanner, which if you use tracking apps, you know this is a really big deal. I recommend Macros First to all my clients and friends, and even had them sponsor my 2024 conference. Here's an example of feature that I love. The verified food database. Remember using other apps and searching for a food only to find 10 to 50 similar options with different macros, not knowing which one to pick. This kind of friction is the shit that made me quit tracking altogether. Macros First, every single food item in the database, over 3 million of them, is human verified. No junk entries, so you can trust the numbers. Plus, that free barcode scanner makes logging faster. And if the barcode doesn't turn anything up, just point your camera at the nutrition label and Macros First will extract all the nutrition info instantly. All this just makes tracking easier. And while Macros First's premium version is incredible for any user, the basic version, which is nowhere near basic, is free to use. So you can go to either the Apple Store or Google Play to download. So you made a comment I think is really poignant earlier about leanness beyond the demands for the sport. So I think we understand there's a lot of sports that strength to body weight ratios are relevant,
Mm-hmm.
gymnastics being one of them. But are we seeing a lot of these athletes? And again, so this discussion can also extend to men too. It's not women centric. Men do sometimes face these pressures, but is there, there wouldn't be a universal level of leanness across sports. We know that, right? But how many of these athletes are actually pursuing leanness and aesthetic goals where it's actually detrimental to their performance? How prevalent is this?
Um, I can't tell you. I don't know how
Mm.
prevalent it is. My personal experience, where I felt it, it's hard to know, was it really physique related? Was it a, a misunderstanding, poor knowledge, around performance nutrition? I'm
Mm.
not quite sure. But back in the day, I'd say 10 years ago for sure, but things are changing quickly in female team sports because they're getting a lot more nutrition care. But it was in soccer.
Mm.
Soccer was distinct, or football, um, was distinct to me because they're running a marathon, basically. It is an incredibly physically demanding sport with no stopping. The women don't fall down and like the men do and stop the game, stop the match.
Mm.
Um, and they were on highly restrictive diets, particularly, afraid of carbohydrate. Um, and and I think a misconception of the leaner, the smaller, the lighter I am, the faster I will be. And um, and in many cases, those young women, unfortunately, were, um, eating such highly restrictive diets, they were underperforming greatly. And when we could start working with them and educating them and changing their diet and opening their minds to a broader intake of, again, carbohydrates in particular, that if they even put on a few pounds, they were actually gaining power in that way. That, with the proper training, of course, with the proper strength and conditioning, they would enhance their performance, not diminish it. And it was really um, stunning to me, the difference, because at the time I was working both in women's soccer and women's basketball. And I did not see this in basketball, hardly to a person, whereas it was rampant in soccer.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. Is it getting better?
I think everything is improving across the board as far as nutrition knowledge. We have, many, many, many more teams that work with nutrition specialists, sports dietitians, sports nutritionists. There's, I think, a greater recognition that I need to eat if I want to be an athlete and perform. I think there's other athletes leading in the field. I mean, the greatest advocate I had when I was working with the Seattle Storm was Sue Bird, who said, do what I do. And if you were a rookie coming in and you looked at Sue Bird and she said, I wish I would have known 10 years ago what I'm learning now. Who knows? I can't imagine her doing any better, but it would have been to my advantage. And so I do think that knowledge has improved, that there are more teams using bona fide, qualified professionals instead of basing what they're doing on the latest trend on the internet. And so I think that's improved. But I do believe that it may be getting more difficult into the collegiate area, where NIL is such a big thing, again, where my physical image is being broadcast, and what I look like matters, and it may not be making me a better athlete.
There's a couple of directions you made me think about is it Sophie Cunningham. She's a rising star, getting a lot of attention in WNBA. Now,
Right.
she surged to super fame because she came to Caitlin Clark's defense. And now I think we could argue that Caitlin Clark is probably the most visible and popular female athlete, possibly of all time, or certainly since Serena at the height of Serena's competitive career. I don't want to come back to Serena, but with Sophie, there's an aesthetic component to her media, right? And I think, at least with the WNBA players, and again, I'm not interested in the socioeconomics of their pay or anything like that. That's a completely different thing. But within that, there's a disproportionate reward financially and opportunity if they have larger media followings, if they have sponsorships,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I understand that there can be those community demands. So now we can go to the other direction I want to ask you about is, we saw Serena Williams recently come out about using
Hmm.
GLP-1 agonist medications. I talked recently with Abby Langer. Abby's not a doctor; she's a registered dietitian, and
Right.
Abby's amazing recent episode. But we talked a little bit about this. But there was backlash.
Hmm.
So, what are your thoughts on that? Is that just another example of the fact that, people are morally policing what Serena is doing with her body?
I think that's a very complex issue around Serena. She's not competing anymore. And yet she is a role model,
Mm,
undeniably, for athletes and people with great hopes and dreams. And is there a confusion there? That's a question among
mm,
the group of dietitians that I know and work with in sports. Is there a confusion between Serena using legal tools at her disposal, um, purely for her goal of health and aesthetic, perhaps? She talks a lot about her own personal health,
mm,
versus athletes trying to use GLP-1 or other drugs
mm.
to accomplish whatever goals they have. And it may again compete with their athletic goals. And so, because she represents really an athlete and not, yes, she's a mom. Yes, she's a woman. Yes, she's, at this point in her life cycle. However, her she's really known as an athlete. Can there be a confusing message there to a young aspiring athlete? That's one question that has arisen.
I want to go to a thing you said with athletes. I would assume that GLP-1 agonist medications would be almost extremely detrimental to performance with what they would do for someone's appetite and ability to fuel.
Absolutely.
I also struggle with the idea that, yes, she's a famous person, role model, as you said, but I wonder, can that be a narrative for people to still feel like they have some say in what she does for herself? She is at her essence, an individual who I tend to bias on the side of I don't think she's accountable to anybody else's opinion about her. But you raise a very valid point. So at what point is it the athlete who's looking at her going, it's my responsibility to be informed about good nutrition and my performance? Can we untangle that?
Yeah, well, yes, I agree with you. She is free to do and say as she pleases. She has certainly taken her knocks and proven her street cred
Mm,
along the way. Um, I I mean, it's up to each individual consumer to know how to take care of themselves.
mm,
Is the voice of an athlete the voice of medical care and direction and guidance? Pff, not to me, but um, but this is the world we live in.
mm,
Like I said, the concern of restrictive dieting, and which obviously she didn't do when she was competing. obviously she cared more about winning. And I mean, I don't want to say, I don't know what she was eating.
Mm,
I didn't work with Serena, but her physical presence was pretty domineering, and she clearly was fueling herself to win. And
mm,
I don't think there was, whatever other emotional issues she dealt with in order to do that, I don't know. She seemed
mm,
to be extremely poised and have a pretty good self-image, at least what she portrayed to the public. I do not know Serena, nor can I speak to anything about her personally. But and now she's taking her personal control and doing what she wants to do in that way. But again, um, to be clear, what what I think can be confusing to an aspiring female athlete
mm,
is, can I, if I feel like I'm bigger than I want to be, and I'm not performing at the level because I'm held back, perhaps because of my size,
mm,
maybe I'm slower than I want to be, maybe I'm not as mobile as I want to be. Um, would it would it be good for me to also
mm,
try a GLP-1 drug or some kind of appetite controlling mechanism, in order to enhance my performance? And the answer is undeniably no. That is not the strategy to
mm.
win. What you need is better strength and conditioning. What you need is good high performance nutrition guidance. What you need is to manage your lifestyle, and all of the things that we know it through coaching and training help an athlete. And then every athlete is not going to be a Serena Williams. I'm sorry, but it's just not going to happen. And so, but to be the best that you can be, going on a very low calorie diet is not going to do it for you.
So this is where I want to go next is because you're already giving some surface level stuff. I want to get more granular. Let's say you have an athlete, and this for sure women, but I mean, this applies to men too. Let's say that they want to fuel for performance. They want elite performance. And maybe there's a component of their sport that they are rewarded for being leaner,
Mhm.
aesthetic, what have you. We can respect that. That's someone's goals. Or there's some weight class consideration,
Mhm.
or maybe that person just naturally tends to bias towards a higher body fat percentage, and they understand. And I would love your thoughts too on, you know, perhaps body fat percentages and where if there's a sweet spot for performance. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to this, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So, but primarily, if someone has these goals, these competing
Mhm.
goals, how would you frame a maybe some short-term stuff, but the long-term strategy to be able to walk that tightrope?
Right. So, I worked a lot with weight class athletes. I worked a lot with physique athletes as well. And I did work with athletes who, in the middle of their competitive season, were going to end up with a photo shoot and
Mm,
wanted to look better than what they looked like at the moment. And so, one underlying tenet that never changes is you never underfuel training. If performance is your goal, you never underfuel training. If you need to pull back on calories to achieve some sculpting or fat loss or whatever you're trying to accomplish, weight loss, then you do it in another time during the day.
mm,
Because we know that energy metabolism operates moment to moment all day long. And so if you underfuel training, well, you're not going to have the fuel to push yourself through that training session and to optimize your outcome from each training bout. However, if you eat well, let's say your training is at 10 o'clock in the morning, so you get up, you have a really good robust breakfast, you have whatever your pre-training fueling is, you go into that training session, you manage that as recommended, and you do your recovery. And now you're kind of at equilibrium instead of in a hole because you've underfueled. And we'll get to underfueling in a moment. But let's say now you're at equilibrium. Okay, Well, now you've done the best you can do immediately post-exercise for recovery. Not required for the average person, and we can talk about that. We're talking about elite performance, right? Where you really have performance goals. So you do your recovery, and now later in the day is when maybe you do reduce some of the calories that you can afford to drop for, let's say, a 2 week period of time, because that's how long you're going to give yourself to go to this shoot or to have this look that you're, or to get to your weight class. This is not, we're not talking about UFC fighters. That's a whole different category and a different specialty, frankly. So we say, okay, the rest of the day is where we can pull out maybe 400 to 600 calories. Typically, those are going to be not from protein, but from carb and maybe a little bit from fat, because this is end of the day. Whereas a high performing athlete can handle a lot of calories. And so we have an abundance of calories, and perhaps even calories that are not nutrient dense calories. Well, that's where we can take those out. And then the next day, and they're not doing 2 a-days, it's one training session a day. And so now we get up in the morning and we do the same thing. And maybe we have lopped off 600 calories a day. And that is typically enough for an athlete to get to, a female athlete, to get a little leaner look and still have her performance unaffected, but only for a period of time. I always would say you get 2 weeks. You can't do this any longer than 2 weeks, because it's going to affect your performance in time. The other side of it is, as I was saying, what if you underfuel your training? And this is the huge misconception. Well, if I don't eat before I train, now I'm going to burn a lot more calories, and I'm going to go into my fat, and I'm going to burn off my fat. Well, actually, if you underfuel training, you actually underperform all the way through training. You never burn as many calories to begin with because you don't have access to them. And what happens is, at the end of that training session, you are in such a metabolic hole. It is very hard to climb out of that, to then actually refuel, recover, grow, get the enhancement that you're looking for your training, and throughout the day, then be able to continue to restrict. I mean, it's backwards. So this moment to moment of thinking, I need to fuel my training. I never underfuel my training. Now I'm at equilibrium. Now I can drop my calories a little bit, and my body is not going to, have any metabolic response to that. It's going to stay high. I'm going to get that benefit of that calorie reduction.
So if I understand it correctly, because I love this, actually makes a lot of sense. For the short durations, for athletes with the goals you stated, calories in, calories out for leanness is still a global thing, right? Total net calories. Whereas you're really thinking about very locally in terms of time fueling for your training. I actually like that. That's actually really smart. And the note about, you made me think, of course, about fasted cardio, which is very popular in the aesthetic world.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think there's two sides. One, for the average person who gets up, works out early, doesn't like having food in their stomach, and they're globally fueling pretty well, they're probably fine.
They're fine.
Well, I worry about the people who buy into the competitive bodybuilder aesthetic athlete swearing that this is this magical thing. I think that's largely been debunked. But the one factor that a lot of people don't put into this, and why I think a lot of the competitive athletes actually kind of do fine with fasted cardio, is the muscle preserving effects of anabolic drugs, right? So that's a game changer when it comes to fasted training or fasted cardio.
Right.
And the average person doesn't even think about that when they're listening to the bodybuilder.
Right. And we used to call them junk miles. right? You're just, if you're out for a run just to burn calories, that
Hmm.
there's no further, and it could be any workout. There's no further goal to that exercise bout than just a calorie burn. Well, then it doesn't matter. If you feel better fasted, then go ahead, do it fasted. But if you want to get a training benefit, it's unlikely that you'll get it because when you're underfueled and undercarbed going in, we've seen this. This has been measured. Rate of perceived exertion can be up at 8, 9, but your watt output is actually very low.
Hmm.
You feel like you're working really hard because you're underfueled. You are pushing really, really hard, and your perception is, I am working out as hard as I can, but your actual watt output for the average person is low. Now, bets are off when we're working with elite athletes and the things that they can accomplish and do, and especially if they are, if they have, sort of extraordinary supplementation going on. I mean, meaning steroids or something else, other kinds of drugs that they're taking. There's an awful lot that we can do, and the mental fortitude and the conditioning that they have and the ability to sort of be inside their bodies and know what they're doing is just different. And then there's, of course, always genetic potential. And so working with an elite athlete is just a different ball game. But with an elite athlete, there should be no reason that they would train fasted. They don't need to just burn calories, just to burn calories. They burn plenty of calories when they're training. It's hard to get enough food in them because very often to fully feed them, they are not empty enough to train. And so the hard part is how do you how do you fuel them? How do you get enough food in them, especially when they're doing 2 and 3 a day workouts, NFL players, and it's very hard to fuel many of them. And of course, that was the beginning of liquid fueling. I mean, you had to have something other than solid food to put in them.
So what you described earlier was more of a short-term strategy if someone would needed to get leader more temporarily.
Right.
What about the longer-term management of that dance with maintaining you know, a certain level of body fat in terms of tactics? Because I would think, would you approach it seasonally? But I guess the risk is during competition season, they need to be fueled for performance, but then the off season is actually your best time to strength train to create positive adaptations. So within that, how would you approach someone who still says, I need to be mindful of not gaining too much body fat? Let's say if they find it easier to do so.
hmm So, yes. So thinking starting off season, you do want to, even gaining muscle. It depends on the sport, right? So working with swimmers, we want them as strong and powerful as they can be, but we don't want them too heavy. And
Mm,
and many sports are like that. Again, that's the power to weight ratio that you're working with. And so watching and working closely with the strength and conditioning coach also. What are, it's that coach's goals. They're driving. What are the goals? And then I work within that with the athletes. So I start with certainly a time of recovery right after the competitive season. It's
mm,
just a downtime. You need mental recovery and physical recovery. Um, and then and that's just eating well. Hopefully the athlete, even though they're kind of on their own at that point, they know what's best for them. They have a little more leeway, a little more freedom with the way they eat, but they know that they know some basic guardrails and they follow that. Hopefully they do. Now you start into the off-season training, and depending on those goals, and typically we do want to increase some strength and power. um, balance, coordination, all of those things. And we're working on uh, a lot of micronutrient density.
Mm.
And so the style of the diet is going to be very plant rich. We want a lot of a big variety of fiber in the diet. All of this is sort of neuromuscular, looking a lot at gut health and and the biome and the connection between the gut and the nervous system and the brain, um, even muscles, all the things that we're trying to coordinate, um, and to build them up as much as we can. So it is ideally an anabolic diet
Mm.
at that point. And so you get through that and that longer time of the off season, and then as you get toward the preseason, the beginning of the season, you may start to taper down and get to more of, if we feel there's a competitive weight or a I mean just a personal competitive weight that you're not even in a weight class, but you know that you feel best at within, a range of 5 pounds. And
Mm.
so, a couple of kilos, we're looking at, can make a big difference of your ability to pivot on the field and all of those things. But you still need some protection around you depending on the sport. Are you in a contact sport and you can't be too lean or you're going to break?
Mm.
We have to consider all of those things. And um, so tapering down just a bit and increasing the cardio workout usually starts to happen. And again, the coaches and trainers are guiding a lot of this. And then we start to get into the competitive season. Now you just want to maintain, and that is often really hard. In many sports, it's hard to maintain weight during the competitive season, as I said, because they have, maybe multiple training sessions when it's not a game day. On game day, like, wow, how do you get fed by the team? Are you on your own to feed yourself? How do you manage all that during competitive season? It can be a time where it's hard to maintain weight, and we're working on that. And then you go into postseason where the athlete is now pretty tired. And and typically, I mean, we've always watched postseason play, and it's always the team that is less tired that comes out on top. You can see the teams start to fatigue in postseason play. Not as bad as it used to be because we have a lot more nutrition support.
Hey, I'm Canadian with hockey. The shit that hockey players will do through the Stanley Cup playoffs and lace up skates for, and then you
Yeah.
find out these ridiculous injuries after the fact. It's comical, but then I mean, there's lots of examples. I think Matthew Tkachuk. I'm from Edmonton, so I
Yeah.
know all my Edmontonian people are going to be really pissed off with Matthew because he's a Florida Panther who's beaten the Oilers last two playoffs. Secret confession: I'm not an Oilers fan at all. I grew up liking the Calgary Flames. Yeah, don't come at me for that.
Oh, okay.
Don't come at me for that, guys. I'm actually kind of ambivalent towards it all. But I mean, Matthew's going to miss what a big chunk of the start of the season because of injuries that
Right.
he more or less played through. I think he may have
Played
had
through.
an
Right.
adductor muscle torn off the bone. I think is one of the things he was playing through. Like these guys are maniacs. To your point, now you mentioned being like I can't remember the exact wording, but basically being like skinny and risking injury. Is there, this might be outside of scope, but is there a level of leanness that makes someone more prone to injury? And if I understand the data correctly, I can't cite studies, but I'm also of the impression that higher levels of obesity, higher body fat percentages does increase injury risk in the general population for a variety of reasons. But yeah, like is maintaining body weight within probably a sweet spot also important for injury management?
Well, I can tell you, again, depending on the sport, but typically, yes, because if you are again, if you're skinny because, or you're extremely lean because you're genetically
Mm,
programmed that way, that's one thing. But if you're under fueling and restricting, well, then you're certainly more prone to injury. Um, I'd say when I started working with the Seattle Seahawks, my first client was Matt Hasselbeck.
mm,
And Matt Hasselbeck, you know, eh, I'd say probably our defensive line wasn't quite as good as it became. And um, and he was getting hurt. He was too thin. He didn't have enough meat on him. He'd
mm,
fall down, he'd get, sacked, and he'd get hurt. And so my role was to put weight on him.
mm.
Um, what was happening with him. And I'm going to tell you this story now. This was in the newspaper. It's public knowledge. So I'm actually very careful. I see myself as a healthcare practitioner, and I don't name a lot of names of clients that I've had, except for those who've either talked about me and at the same time given me permission to talk about them. Well, Matt was known in the clubhouse as the ice cream boy. And at the end of every game, or when they would be at away games, they'd have like half a dozen the big ice cream Dove bars on the plane for him. He would eat it, or he'd come home and have a ton of ice cream. And so I sit down with him and I do a diet recall and learn what he's eating. Well, the quarterback has many training times during the day, physical training day. They do their own lifting. They have their own quarterback training time, but then they're also working with all the other athletes because they need to be there to throw the ball so all the other teams can be practicing.
Mm.
And so maybe 4 workouts a day, sometimes 5, in those days. And he would get to end of practice during um, uh, spring training, having eaten maybe 1,200 calories because he had a hard time with any food in his stomach.
Mm.
And so he'd get to the end of his day and he required, just to maintain his body weight, 5,000 calories a day to maintain. He was tall and
Mm.
he had highly metabolic. And he was getting home at the end of the day having consumed about 1,500 calories. Well, no wonder why he was eating ice cream. He was starving. His body was like, get some calories, some dense calories into me. So there was a betting pool at the clubhouse on whether or not I would get him to stop eating ice cream. That was kind of the thing. So we sat down, we put a plan together, and at the end of, we walked through everything. We did a lot of liquid nutrition for him so that he could get in closer to 3,000 calories before the end of the day. And then he would go home and have a really great dinner. And I said, and you can have ice cream, right? And he was like, oh my gosh, you've actually programmed in ice cream for me. And I said, well, if I didn't tell you could have ice cream, you would say, well, you're a nice lady and everything, but I'm not going to follow your program, right? And he goes, yeah. And I said, well, so yeah, go for it. But you decide how much ice cream you want. I didn't give him an amount. I said, but I want you eating all of this, and we worked up to it. It didn't happen overnight, of course. That's a really hard change for anybody to make. So we worked up to it. And after about 10 days, when he was fully on the program, he called and said, hey, doc, do I have to be eating this ice cream at night? What other snack could I have? I don't really want it anymore. And so that was the testament to, if you're really hungry, you're going to eat what's available and what's going to give you this, your body's going to tell you what you need in a way. This isn't always why people eat ice cream, but in his case, it was physical. It wasn't emotional eating. And then once he was fully fueled, it's not what he wanted. What other healthy choice could I have at night instead of ice cream? So it, to me, it was such a great story of letting, of fueling your body, giving it what it needs. And he didn't have an emotional disorder. That has to be really clear because a lot of people do. He did not. And so it drove him to, what other healthy thing could I be eating? I don't really want this ice cream anymore.
And there's a brilliant coaching lesson in there too. It's just creating autonomy for the person, giving them a lot more choice and really successful outcome. So hopefully the coach is listening, like drive that home, okay? Stop being so authoritarian with here. Just do this, do this, do this, shut up and follow my instructions. Right. Are there any indications, red flags you look for or want someone to be aware of if they're under fueling? Because I have a feeling many people probably think they're getting enough fuel and they're probably underperforming and under fueling.
So, I mean, just on that topic, I probably every female athlete that I worked with underfueled. Many unwittingly thought they were doing a good job and didn't know. And typically it was by around 800 calories a day. I had some that was 1,000, but that's a minor, difference really. But typically 800 calories a day, and it was typically 800 calories of carbs. Almost, almost, almost universally, it was carbohydrate. And when we talk to other sports dietitian, when we all talk to each other, when we, and everybody agrees, yep, I see the same thing. Yeah, I see the same thing. So in female athletes, yes. And it's, like I said, it's not always intentional. They just don't know that they can eat more. So red flags, uh, you know, they're, you need to talk to athletes, right? And how fatigued are they? What is their recovery like? Do they wake up in pain? Um, Sometimes it's a sport. You're working with downhill mountain bike racers, they're going to wake up in pain. They crash a lot. So, so, but recovery, a poor recovery is a red flag. Poor sleep, red flag. Underfueled athletes don't sleep well. When you're hungry, you don't sleep well. Talk to any dieting UFC athlete. They are not sleeping well. When you see, I'm trying to think of something, most coaches are not eating with their athletes. They're not really seeing what they're eating. There's a trust level based on, if you really want to perform, you should be honest with me about what you're eating, because I can't help you if you're not honest with me. Mm-hmm. I rarely had a problem with that, but I also did not take on clients with eating disorders. I sent them, I referred them out. I didn't have the chops to be working with athletes with eating disorders. And I didn't need to retool myself to do that. And so I did work with a couple. I certainly worked with recovered athletes, but you start to see symptoms of, like I said, recovery is poor, maybe coming late to practice. If it's an early morning practice, early morning, and they're always late, they're sleeping in, they're not sleeping well, probably. And I would really review nutrition. There are also emotional things. Anxiety will affect your ability to eat, will affect how your stomach feels. Those characteristics are important to check in on. And certainly if an athlete seems to be too cold or um, uh, I mean, they start to report all kinds of things to coaches that just seem abnormal. Um, it happens. My husband is a dentist, and I had a coach call me about an athlete that I had worked with years before. They were still working with, who said, I noticed when she drinks and spits that I think that what she's spitting out is pink. So it was water
Mm.
going in, probably bleeding gums coming out. And so that is a red flag. That is a red flag. It could be just poor dental hygiene, but it shouldn't be that profound. And it's more likely at that point, she was so restricting that she had a vitamin deficiency. And so there's, and there was something about not eating fruit. Fruit had sugar in it. I don't eat any fruit. It was literally a vitamin C deficiency. And
Mm.
so it's weird stuff. Like athletes will get into weird stuff. And you just have to kind of keep your ear to the ground, I think, and be closely aligned with them or make sure that you're working with someone who is following them closely.
Quick thought, because you reminded me of this. I've definitely seen that celebrities, and I would equate athletes and celebrities in some regards. I think athletes are definitely surrounded by more credible, well-educated, people on nutrition like yourself, the ones that are.
Mhm.
But I definitely noticed that they can be very vulnerable, like the general population. I suppose maybe it's not even disproportionate to the general population, to the influence of uh, pseudoscience and the loud voices that say a lot of, well, quite frankly, nonsensical things about nutrition. So that makes sense that they would be just as vulnerable as opposed to us just assuming that they have great expertise in evidence-based nutrition. There was one thing you mentioned, the being cold. So I'm going to presume that's, they're restricted on calories to the point where they're just the heat, they're not producing heat. They're not
Mhm.
as active, not as much need. So that leads to the question, because we would assume, at least intuitively, if someone is under fueling relative to what they're outputting, then they would be losing weight, you would theoretically think. But there's also going to be some downregulating of certain metabolic processes. So do we often see them losing weight? That's including muscle mass or getting leaner if they're underfueled.
Well, yes, over time, but it may take a little time. The body is so interesting. So, one of the things we learned about female athletes, years ago, we knew it seemed like they should have been burning more calories and requiring more calories than they were consuming, and yet they were still able to compete and win. So what was it about the female body? Well, it wasn't just the female body, it's both male and female, but we were observing this in female athletes. And what we understand now is that the body will preferentially fuel the high energy demand. And so if you are under fueling, you will be able to, again, this seems to go against what I talked about with never under fuel training, but in time it catches up with you. So just, bear with me for a second. So they run fast and win, right? And then will have like nothing left over for all of their other systems that are so important. Our reproductive system, our neuromuscular system, our cardiovascular system, all those systems will be underfueled, and we will preferentially fuel the high energy demand and in the moment. Well, that works for a period of time until you're losing bone, until your brain
Hmm.
isn't functioning very well, until you're and women in particular, our reproductive system turns off. So, and in time, each one of these systems takes away from our total health and well-being. And so women had very short competitive careers because they would break. They couldn't they couldn't compete for long periods of time, year after year after year. They would have short competitive careers. And that's, this was the beginning of really understanding the female athlete triad and what was happening. And that if we're preferentially fueling the high energy demand in the moment, um, and so you get this big bang for your buck the first year that you underfuel. Typically distance athletes will find that, or even sprint athletes will find that they just take off like a rocket for a year, and then they start to crash because they can't sustain that. The health consequences of that underfueling supersede their ability to continue to train hard. And so if you want a long, successful career, you need to fuel. Do we see weight loss? Sometimes in the beginning, it's not quite as apparent. And many athletes are really good at hiding it. They start to wear long sleeves. They start to have longer, maybe they wear long pants instead of shorts. They start to, or a baggy shirt. I mean, they really cover it up if it's become a noticeable weight loss. If they're being weighed in, well, then it's going to show up.
Hmm. And you mentioned eating disorders. How prevalent, and this doesn't have to be like a numerical value, but how prevalent are eating disorders in, it's not just high level athletes, but athletic populations?
I believe, and I'm going to say I don't think I've really looked at that data recently. I mean, for a while we thought it was no different than the average population, but I believe it is higher, but I don't know the numbers. And we don't know if it's the athletics that promote the eating disorder or if people self-select themselves into athletics. I don't think that's clear at all. I think there might be a higher proportion, perhaps within physique sports.
Mm.
It kind of but again, even when I speak to the athletes, they say this sport attracted me because I was already good at restricting.
It's a socially acceptable way to engage in some of these behaviors that in isolation would have great negative stigma attached to
Right.
them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I'm going to be honest, I don't have my fingers on that data.
I guess it's just still something that we should be alert to because again, sort of analogous to what I just said, I suppose in general sports, if you have someone who has, because we think about eating disorders mostly on the nutrition side, but you would probably have a better handle on the definition of orthorexia than I do, but I tend to use that more as a broader term about people who will engage in the calorie output side of things as a way to control their, well, stay lean, body mass, et cetera. And of course, sports, athletics, exceptionally socially acceptable way to manage it more on the output side than
Mhm.
the traditional eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, et cetera, binge eating on the input side. Is that
Right.
fair?
Yeah, I just think there's all kinds of symptoms we can look for. And every person who engages in this is deeply dedicated to hiding it.
Mm.
And so, I mean, you really need to be a trained professional. And even if it's not your specialty, you should take a class, do a webinar, do something to inform yourself so that you you at least have some set of tools to identify a potential problem. When I worked with teams, I would always, pre-season kind of give there are several standardized questionnaires that you can give to all the members of the team just to get a read on how these people are responding. And it's a simple questionnaire that you analyze, and you can, there's the eating disorders inventory. There's a number of questionnaires out there. There's new ones all the time. And it gives you a read, and hopefully the athletes are honest in answering, and you can spot a potential problem. It can be dramatic. I was asked to, this is again a number of years ago, a woman who was the fastest US ultra distance runner.
Mm.
And I was called by her orthopedic surgeon saying that she had had several broken bones, and they had done surgery and she wasn't healing. Could I work with her? So she came in, and her story was that she ran, I can't think of it. It's the race in Death Valley.
Heard of it? I'm
Oh,
not
it's a
sure. Yeah.
very famous. It's a quad marathon, and it ends at the top of a mountain. So you, and then the end is quite a steep climb. Everyone listening is going to go, oh, it's this one. I can't think of it right now, but it's a quad marathon in Death Valley, and she fractured she had a hairline fracture. It wasn't a frank fracture in her pelvis
Mm.
at the beginning of the third length, and somewhere at the beginning of the fourth length, she fractured her tibia, and she finished the race. She finished the race.
Good Lord.
So she comes to me, and my first question was, and now they've put pins in her and they've put her all back together. And it's something like 2 months later, and she's not healing. And I said, how much are you running? And she said, oh, not that much, like about 30 miles a week. And I said, what did the doctors tell you about running? And she said, oh, well, they said I shouldn't do anything if it hurts. And I thought, she ran a double marathon with broken bones. This woman doesn't feel what hurts, right? So, I mean, honestly, I'm not going to give away too much, but I mean, there was a lot of psychological counseling that had to be added to my care. And I called the physicians and I said, you guys got to get on board with the client, the patient that you've got, and the kinds of instructions that you give them. She had to stop running or she wasn't going to heal. Not to mention that there was a lot of diet restriction that had led to this. Probably the pelvic fracture happened on its own. And the tibia she fell and broke the tibia, but the pelvic fracture, she never fell. So that was probably part of eating disorder issues, and had developed over many years. So the answer to this is how high performers can just blast through all kinds of symptoms, and you've got to be aware of what is really happening rather than just the way they present.
Wow, that sounds like some David Goggins level stuff. Now, for the record, I don't admire David Goggins, and there are some questions as to the veracity of all of the things that he's claimed in his book. That is something that is floating around there, to each their own. I think there's great wisdom in being able to go, okay, I could find another gear, but that level of like, no, I don't buy into that stuff at all. That's an astonishing story. Okay, one last thing I definitely want to sneak in here. Are there any micronutrient deficiencies that you commonly see in athletic women, athletic populations that you want people to be alert to?
Yeah, well, so there's the big ones. Iron, vitamin D, Um, Vitamin D in indoor athletes is extraordinarily common. I would say when I work with basketball players, it can be half the team can have remarkably low vitamin D levels. And so, and you need to do vitamin D testing. It can't be, oh, we're just going to supplement everybody. Do a vitamin D test, get whatever medical care, program is taking care of these athletes, and make sure they're vitamin D tested. And they should be tested at the end of the winter, not at the end of the summer. And some teams test twice, but twice a year. But it's very important to do vitamin D testing. I would have athletes say, yeah, I'm able to play, but God, I'm just dragging. I don't know what's the matter with me. Check their vitamin D and it's so low. And give them, supplement them. Then you have to test again and make sure that the supplementation is enough for them. It's highly individual, our absorption of vitamin D. And so testing, having a retest to make sure that your supplementation level is adequate. And they will notice they are not dragging, they're sleeping better. There's all kinds of outward signs that they've been living with for a long time and had no idea what was going on. Certainly iron in women also very important. And it's important to test ferritin levels, not just hemoglobin and hematocrit, because women can be marginally well, anybody can, but it's much more common in women, especially women during their reproductive years that are menstruating. They can be marginally iron deficient, meaning that they're not anemic. That's iron deficiency. Frank iron deficiency, they're anemic. They're not anemic. But we know that low ferritin levels, low iron stores impact performance, physical performance. Even in an average woman who is like not a sports or active woman at all, there have been documentations of sitting longer throughout the day versus just her general activity throughout the day when she is marginally iron deficient. So it's important to be checking beyond just hemoglobin and hematocrit.
Magnesium, it's one of the most deficient things across populations in general on average. Is that even more an issue with athletes, or is it just, hey, everybody should be alert to magnesium?
I think it's a fairly universal issue, some people more than others. It really depends on how much whole grain do you eat? There's some nuts, whole grains, because we're kind of restricting those, and we need so much more in the diet than people are eating. Magnesium is profound because it's in something like 400 enzymatic reactions in the body. Um, and so it's very important. And but it's also, be careful about supplementing too much, because magnesium will also give you the trots. And so if you that's not something you want to put on an athlete. So it's really important to use a high quality, magnesium glycinate, something like that, a high quality, highly absorbable form, so you don't have to supplement as much. The same thing with iron. Iron supplementation is a real problem because it can be constipating. Calcium does the same thing. And so this is where having
Balance them out a bit, like
so dietitians are really important to have on the team. Dietitians are fairly singular in their knowledge of translating the science of nutrition into food and supplements. And so you may understand grams and milligrams. You may understand, energy metabolism, but can you actually design a diet where it's made up of food and beverage and dietary supplements that work together that the athlete is going to follow and eat. Interviewing that athlete, understanding their obstacles, understanding foods that they like and dislike, all of these things. There is no perfect diet. You put together the perfect diet. If the person doesn't eat it, it doesn't really matter. So, so you know, I know that there are a lot of people that have nutrition knowledge. You also need to understand food science and probably recipes. And if you're eating at this restaurant versus this place versus that place, you're on the road, how can we meet your needs? How can we put together, food for on the road? How do you learn to prep? For all of these things, I think a dietitian plays a really important role, but the dietitian needs to be a specialist as well, not a generalist, not somebody who is just oriented toward weight loss. This needs to be someone who really has not just an academic background, but real experience in working with athletes and teams.
Wonderful. I've had several dietitians here on the podcast over the recent run of episodes. I'll shout out Taylor Ryan, the sports dietitian. She's wonderful out of Australia. My friend Dan Feldman, the powerlifting dietitian.
Yeah.
He was a guest a while ago. He's great. Holly Baxter was on recently. Now, our episode was more about muscle building stuff, but Holly herself is also, a dietitian. And there's numerous other people. Abby Langer, again, was on recently and is just wonderful. So this has been pure masterclass. I use that word occasionally, but selectively for the episodes that really just drill down on something. This has been spectacular. I will be absolutely having you back. I regret not having pulled you on here long ago. People can follow you at,
Okay, I'm still around.
yeah. They can follow you on Instagram at Power Eat. I love the handle. Power Eat is great. Are there any other resources you want to point people to? Any of your books you'd like to single out?
Well, probably the new Power Eating is, so that was the 5th edition of sort of my legacy title, Power Eating. And we came up with this very innovative title, The New Power Eating. That's the latest. I have not, full disclosure, I've not updated it. I think, writing books these days is, should I do it? Should I not? I should be more online. Who does that serve? So, but it still certainly stands the test of time as a solid evidence-based guide. And then I'm at my website, drsKleiner.com. I don't do very much individual coaching anymore. I mostly work in industry now. I find that that the innovation happening in the food, beverage, dietary supplement industry is so exciting, and being able to be the voice of the consumer to those innovative brands is very rewarding and a lot of fun. So I'm doing a lot of that kind of consulting now.
I love that because I will always tell each individual person that you can't wait for the world, policy to change. You have to advocate for yourself, learn and apply. But on a system-wide level, the way that we make the most change to our society is at the systemic level. If you're working within that, that's amazing. Everybody, please go follow Susan. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat today. This was amazing.
My pleasure, Andrew. This was great. I'll come back anytime.
Oh, done.